and welcome. My name is Brian Caplen. I'm editor of The Banker. We're at the annual meeting of the IMF in Washington. I'm here with Tim Adams. He's the president of the Institute of International Finance, which also holds its annual meeting concurrently with the IMF. Tim, so why do you do that, and what's on the agenda this year?
First, Brian, thank you for having me. Well, we do it because so many of our members or firms are come in, and we have officials, finance ministers, central bankers here. So we've got everyone here. We might as well get them together and have an honest conversation about the challenges we face globally.
Okay. All right. And what's special about this meeting? I think you've got record numbers here. Is that right?
We've got record numbers. Over 2,000 people participating, the highest participation rate we've ever had. 88 countries represented, 150 members of the press, and more panels and more topics than we've ever had before.
Okay. And I know you've put out some research on some key topics recently. One of those being QE, quantitative easing, and what implications that has for the emerging markets. And we saw that, you know, just the hint of it a few months back sent shockwaves around the world economy. So what have you
It's been a tough couple of the summer months was tough for the emerging markets, but I think it was a bit of a stress test, a wake-up call for what is eventually going to happen, which is this ocean of cheap and abundant capital is going to recede. And the EMs need to find a better space. They need better policy, and they need to think about structural reforms. And so what we've looked at is how the 10 different emerging markets should prepare for the eventual reversal of these cheap capital flows.
Okay, and you've also put out a study on the leverage ratio, obviously a key topic for bankers at the moment. So what's the thinking about the leverage ratio?
Well, we continue to make the case that there is a role for the leverage ratio as a backup constraint, but not as the binding constraint.
Because not as a substitution for risk-weighted assets.
Absolutely. Yeah. Risk-weighted assets is still, we think, the most appropriate way for banks to manage their balance sheets. If you have a leverage ratio as the binding constraint, you're just going to leverage up your balance sheet, which is inconsistent with the whole concept of the reforms that have been put in place the last 5 years.
Okay, all right. And I know you've got a banking panel on tomorrow.
We do.
So what's the thinking behind that?
Well, there are two panels. One is this, we want to look at the myth of smaller and simpler. It sounds great, it's got this wonderful lure, but in fact, it runs counter to the kinds of things we talked about before. We think Basel III works, it's fine. This idea that you can use a simple leverage ratio and achieve what you want to achieve, we think is a bit of a myth.
Okay. All right, and what's your general thinking about the global economic recovery? Especially at the moment, we're in a situation where we've got a shut-down government in the US, which is a bit of the fly in the ointment, but do you think that's just going to pass and then we're going to carry on? Or?
I think we're going to find at least a 6 to 8 week resolution, but I think we're in for a protracted period of differences about the trajectory of fiscal policy in the US. The European economy has probably seen its worst, but it's still a bit soggy, and the emerging markets are slowing. So we're soggy growth globally. We need an engine of growth, and hopefully the US can play that engine at some point in the future.
Okay, but I mean, isn't it coming to the end of the era when the US always plays the engine of growth? I mean, you know, that's been going on my whole life.
Well, that was the idea, that we would have a rotation of demand away from the developed countries, away from the US to emerging markets. That hasn't happened and is not happening now. The EM world is slowing. So everyone is here in Washington looking for the US to again show leadership. They want us to be the consumer of last resort.
Okay. Tim, thank you very much.
Thank you, Brian.
I've been talking to Tim Adams, president of the Institute of International Finance, at the occasion of their annual meeting coinciding with the IMF in Washington.